What if Canada, yes, a North American powerhouse, became part of the European Union? Sound crazy, right? But here's the shocker. Legally, it's not impossible. Economically, it would shake up global markets. Politically, it could rewrite the balance of power between the EU, the US, and NATO. And the biggest twist? Nearly half of Canadians already support deeper EU ties. Think about it. Canada's trade relations with Europe are stronger than ever. Its legal framework mirrors European traditions, and its military is already deeply tied to NATO and defense. Plus, geographically, it's closer to Europe than you'd expect. And if the EU has bent the rules for expansion before, who's to say they wouldn't do it again? This isn't just a wild theory. It's a real geopolitical puzzle that few people even consider. But those who understand these shifts, they see the world differently. So, let's break it all down, because once you hear the facts, you'll never look at global politics the same way again. Most people don't realize just how geographically connected Canada is to Europe. Sure, it's on the other side of the Atlantic, but did you know that Canada's northernmost point is only about 2,400 kilometers from Finland? That's closer than London is to Moscow. In the grand scheme of geopolitics, physical distance has always played a crucial role in trade relations and strategic partnerships. If proximity alone were a defining factor, Canada's Canada membership case wouldn't seem so far-fetched, would it? Beyond the numbers, Canada's access to the Arctic creates an even deeper link to Europe. The Arctic Circle is a battleground for economic influence, resource claims, and even NATO and defense concerns. European nations like Norway, Denmark, via Greenland, and Finland all have a vested interest in Arctic security, just as Canada does. The economic impact of Arctic trade routes is growing, and Canada's position makes it a natural partner in this evolving landscape. Now, let's talk historical context, because history often shapes the present. Viking explorers set foot on what is now Canadian soil long before Columbus discovered the Americas. Their interactions with indigenous populations marked some of the first unofficial cultural ties between Canada and Europe. Fast forward to today, and Canada's participation in global forums, from the legal framework of international treaties to military alliances, continues to align it with European interests. So, is Canada truly as distant from the EU as it seems? Geography suggests otherwise. And if distance isn't the deal breaker, what about population and land area? How would Canada reshape the EU if it became a member? Well, let's get into that. But before we do, if you love unraveling hidden truths and seeing the world through a smarter lens, hit that like button and subscribe. Trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. Imagine the European Union suddenly tripling in size overnight. Sounds wild, right? Well, that's exactly what would happen if Canada-EU membership became a reality. Canada, with its vast 9.98 million square kilometers, would overshadow every existing member, turning the EU into a global giant in sheer landmass. But it's not just about space. Canada's 39 million people would make it the fifth most populous EU country, ahead of Poland, Spain, and the Netherlands. Geopolitics isn't just about borders, it's about influence. And this move, it would redefine the EU's power map. Now, consider what this means for the economic impact of the EU. Canada boasts a $2.2 trillion GDP, ranking it among the world's top economies. If it were part of the EU, it would immediately become the fourth largest economy in the bloc, behind Germany, France, and Italy. That's a massive shift in the EU's trade relations, one that would force serious recalibrations in policy, resource distribution, and global positioning. Could Canada's legal framework even adapt to the complex EU regulatory system? That's the million-dollar question. But let's not ignore the cultural factor. Canada isn't just vast in size, it's also incredibly diverse. Its bilingual status, English and French, already aligns with European linguistic traditions, strengthening its cultural ties with the continent. Plus, cities like Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal have thriving European communities, further blurring the line between Canadian and European. The question isn't whether Canada fits into Europe. It's whether Europe is ready to accommodate a country so uniquely positioned between North America and the EU. So, if Canada can match the EU in population influence and economic power, what's stopping it? One word: legality. The European Union has strict membership rules, and according to Article 49, new members must be European states. But here's the twist. No one has ever truly defined what that means. Could Canada actually qualify under EU law? Well, let's take a closer look. Now, let's talk about the fine print. According to Article 49 of the Treaty on European Union, any country seeking membership must be a European state. But here's the catch. There's no official definition of what European actually means. In theory, this leaves the door open for countries with strong geopolitical and trade relations with the EU, like Canada, to make a case for entry. If Turkey, which straddles both Europe and Asia, has long been a candidate, why not Canada? The legal framework of the EU is complex, but it's also flexible when political will is strong enough. Greenland, a Danish territory, withdrew from the EU in 1985, even though it's geographically in North America. Cyprus, which is geographically closer to the Middle East than Europe, is a full-fledged EU member. So, could Canada use its cultural ties and historical connections to argue its way in? The precedent is there. If the EU were willing to stretch the definition of European even further. And let's not forget that Canada already aligns with many EU policies. From environmental laws to human rights frameworks, Canada mirrors European standards far more than some existing EU candidates. In fact, Canada's economic impact on the EU is already significant thanks to trade relations like CETA, Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement. It's not a legal shortcut, but it does prove that Canada and the EU are already deeply integrated in ways that go beyond geography. But here's the real question. Even if Canada could technically qualify, should it? The EU has never accepted a country so far from its borders, and doing so would set a massive precedent. It wouldn't just be a legal issue. It would be a shift in how the world defines NATO and defense, economic alliances, and political identity. And speaking of identity, Canada's deep historical and cultural ties to Europe play a major role in this debate. So let's explore that next. Here's where things get really tricky. The European Union's Article 49 states that any European state can apply for membership. But here's the catch. What exactly qualifies as a European state? Nowhere in EU law is this term strictly defined, leaving plenty of room for interpretation. Geopolitics is full of gray areas. And if history has taught us anything, it's that legal loopholes often shape global decisions. Could Canada leverage its cultural ties and deep economic integration with Europe to make a case? Some experts believe it's not as impossible as it seems. Let's not forget that past EU expansions have already pushed the definition of European to its limits. Cyprus, for example, is geographically closer to the Middle East than Europe, yet it's an EU member. Turkey has spent decades negotiating its accession, despite its Eurasian identity. Canada, with its legal framework built on European traditions and its participation in major Western alliances, could theoretically present a unique argument. After all, if the EU considers closer ties with North Africa, why not North America? Then, there's the economic impact angle. The EU has always made exceptions when it benefited the bloc financially. For instance, Norway and Switzerland aren't members, but they enjoy deep trade relations with the EU. Canada already has the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, CETA, with Europe, proving that economic integration is feasible. If the EU ever sought to counterbalance US dominance in global markets, embracing Canada could be a strategic move. But legal eligibility is just one piece of the puzzle. Because here's something even more compelling. Canada's cultural ties to Europe run deeper than most people realize. And when you consider the role of history in shaping modern alliances, the idea of Canada in the EU starts to feel a lot less far-fetched. But how deep do these connections really go? Well, let's take a look. And before we do, if you're finding this breakdown fascinating, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe. This is the kind of knowledge most people overlook, but not you. Canada's connection to Europe isn't just a distant memory. It's woven into the very fabric of the nation. From its legal framework to its official languages, the country is a living testament to cultural ties with the Old World. Think about it. Canada was shaped by British and French colonial rule, and to this day, it operates under a Westminster-style parliamentary system. That means its governance is more aligned with Europe than with its next-door neighbor, the United States. The echoes of European influence are everywhere, from legal traditions to social policies. And let's not ignore the elephant in the room, Quebec. Canada has a French-speaking province with a culture deeply intertwined with France. The EU has always championed cultural diversity, and Quebec alone could serve as a natural bridge between Canada and Europe. In fact, Quebec already maintains strong trade relations with the EU, independently fostering economic and political partnerships. If any part of Canada looks and feels like Europe, it's Quebec. But does that give Canada an advantage in its hypothetical bid for EU membership? Beyond language, Canada's population is largely made up of European descendants. Millions trace their heritage back to Ireland, Italy, Germany, and beyond, maintaining a deep-rooted cultural connection to Europe. Even in daily life, Canada aligns more closely with European values. Universal healthcare, strong social safety nets, and an emphasis on diplomacy and geopolitics. It's no surprise that Canada often finds itself siding with Europe rather than the US in global policy debates. That shared worldview could be a compelling argument for closer ties or even full membership. But let's take this one step further. Canada isn't just culturally European, it's also strategically positioned in global defense. As a NATO and defense ally, it plays a crucial role in military cooperation. But here's the real question. If Canada were to join the EU, what would that mean for its military commitments? Would it create a stronger Western alliance, or would it complicate existing security dynamics? That's where things start to heat up. Now, here's where things get complicated. Canada is already a key player in NATO and defense, standing alongside both the EU and the US in military operations. But if Canada were to join the EU, it would raise serious questions about its role in global security. Would Canada lean more toward European defense strategies, or would it remain closely tied to the United States? Given the growing uncertainty about US commitments to NATO, some European nations might see Canada's Canada-EU membership as a strategic move to reinforce Western military strength. One thing's for sure, Canada's military doctrine has long been influenced by both geopolitics and European partnerships. Its troops have trained alongside EU forces, and its defense policies often align with European interests. But there's also a balancing act at play. If Canada formally integrated into EU defense structures, it could create friction with Washington. The U.S. relies on Canada as a trusted ally, and any shift in trade relations or military allegiance could send shockwaves through North American security agreements. And let's talk about Arctic defense. With the Arctic opening up due to climate change, new security challenges are emerging. Russia has been aggressively expanding its military presence in the region, and both Canada and the EU have a vested interest in countering that influence. If Canada were part of the EU, Arctic security policies would have to be reevaluated. Would European forces be deployed to Canada's northern territories? Would Canada have to comply with EU-wide military initiatives? These are the types of questions that could reshape modern geopolitics. But security isn't the only factor at play here. Because if Canada were to join the EU, its economic impact would be just as significant as its military one. And that's where things get really interesting. How would Canada's economy fit into the European model? The numbers tell a fascinating story, and we're about to break them down. Let's talk numbers, because Canada's economy is no small player. With a $2.2 trillion GDP, it would instantly become the fourth largest economy in the EU, right behind Germany, France, and Italy. That kind of economic impact would shake up the bloc's financial dynamics, especially in industries like energy, mining, and agriculture. But here's where things get tricky. Canada is deeply tied to the U.S. market, with a staggering 77% of its exports heading south. Could it realistically shift toward Europe without causing economic instability? That's the billion-dollar question. And trade wouldn't be the only challenge. Canada uses the Canadian dollar, while the EU operates on a euro. Unlike new EU applicants that are expected to adopt the euro, Canada would face a unique dilemma. Would it be forced to abandon its currency? The euro has been a unifying force, but has also caused financial strain in countries like Greece and Italy. Would Canada want to take that risk? Or would it negotiate a legal framework similar to Denmark's, maintaining its currency while integrating into EU economic structures? Then there's the issue of trade relations. Canada already has a deep economic partnership with the EU through CETA, Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, which has eliminated most tariffs between the two. But full Canada-EU membership would mean even deeper integration, shared regulations, open markets, and a shift in economic priorities. Could Canada handle stricter EU policies on environmental standards and labor laws? And how would European industries react to Canada's massive natural resource sector competing in their markets? These economic complexities make one thing clear. Canada's integration wouldn't be simple. But economic factors alone don't determine political decisions. Because beyond trade and finance, there's another major force driving international alliances: political tensions. And with growing US-Canada friction, the possibility of stronger EU ties is becoming more than just theoretical. So, now you see it. Canada and the EU isn't as crazy as it sounds. The legal loopholes, trade shifts, and geopolitical twists are all real. But here's the real question. What other global power plays are happening right now that no one is talking about? Because the world isn't random. It's a game of strategy. And those who understand the moves before they happen, they always stay ahead. If you want to keep unlocking these hidden insights, hit that subscribe button now, because this is just the beginning.